Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started here today. Finish up on time. Welcome to the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, where today we are presenting our fourth Merienda Brown Bag Lecture for Spring 2017. If this is your first time attending a lecture, we usually hold them here in this room at 12 p.m. We'll have some sort of food and refreshments available, so if you haven't got anything, it's all available to you. Please do that. We'll probably have plenty, so you can probably grab one on your way out as well. Following the presentation by our speaker, there'll be plenty of time for question and answer and discussion, so please prepare to do that as well. If you're interested in other events like these, we have a whole bunch of different literature over here at the table. You can also find us all the events and programs that we offer on our website, and as well as social media. And as well over here on this table, we have a few different travel study abroad opportunities that you might want to check out if you're interested to study abroad this summer or later on in the fall. And we have some graduate student buttons, so I don't know if any of you are graduate students, but maybe you know people, but it's Graduate Student Appreciation Week, so those are there for you to take, and as well as anything that's there in front of you. What's there in front of you I want to speak a little bit about, first is our next Merienda, which will be next month, Thursday, May 4th. It'll be featuring Manuela Gonzalez Bueno. She is from the KU Department of Curriculum and Teaching, and she's going to be focusing her presentation on foreign language education, and specifically about translingual qualities in Spanish dialects throughout Latin America. Once again, it's going to be at 12 p.m. here in this room on Thursday, May 4th. In addition, later today is Coffee with a Diplomat with Robert Andrew. That's the orangish colored one in front of you there, so if you're interested to attend that. He's our diplomat in residence, and so this kind of an informal coffee session to kind of learn a little bit about different career opportunities that are available and a little bit about what he does himself. And that's going to be today at 3 p.m. in the Alderson Auditorium in the Union. Tomorrow, at Friday, and I believe that's at 10 to 11, and it's going to be here in this room. We have Anne Bargaris. She's going to be speaking at our International Jobs Talk, which is co-sponsored by a variety of international programs and academic units and student organizations here on campus. She works for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and so she's going to be speaking about her career there and how she's gotten to that point. And the idea of those talks are really to give you kind of some information, kind of a little bit, have a chat with professional in a field of international focus. Lastly, at the Spencer Museum of Art and the Student Gallery is a collection of Afro-Cuban art that's been curated by students in a joint collaboration project between an art history class as well as a Latin American and Caribbean Studies class. That information is over here, so you can pick it up. You can also find out more information about that on our website as well as on our social media pages. So those are all of the events that we have coming up here in the next couple of days. Last thing that I might mention is that we have a Safe Zone training, so if you are interested to become certified with Safe Zone, we have that here in this room on Monday from 9 to 12. We have a few more spots available, so if you're interested to attend that, you may do that as well. And lastly then, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. This is Professor Grieco, a historian of colonial Latin America, whose work on the political economy of Spanish America challenges widespread assumptions about Latin America's path to development. She published her first book in 2014, The Politics of Giving, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, Donors, Lenders, Subjects, and Citizens, from the University of New Mexico Press, and is currently working on her second monograph, Conflict and Voice, the Political and Emotional Cultures of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata. Professor Grieco's work has been funded by multiple grants, including 2 from the University of Missouri Research Fund, and she teaches Latin American history from the pre-colonial period to the present at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And she is also a runner and soccer mom as well. Yeah, there was something else that she added there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Professor Grieco.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming over here today. And this presentation is a section of a chapter of my new book. I have been working on this presentation in this section for a while, and I am aware it needs to click in with the larger narrative, and I'll be happy to do that in the Q&A. I will be focused primarily on the presentation, which is based on the portrait of Francisco de Paula Sanz, and the title of my presentation is Francisco de Paula Sanz, His Image, His Power. So, the portrait of Francisco de Paula Sanz, although one of the few full-body portraits produced in the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, has only received marginal scholarly attention. Located today in the Museo Histórico Nacional in Buenos Aires, this portrait was first reproduced in the volumes of the Biblioteca de Mayo, a primary source collection published in Buenos Aires in the 1960s. Despite its uniqueness and availability, this painting failed to catch the attention of historians and art historians alike. General histories of the arts, crafts, and architecture in the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata emphasize the relative poverty of the region's non-religious artistic production. If they mention Sanz's portrait at all, it is only in passing and one of the examples of colonial portraiture. In 1964, Sanz's portrait made its way into a colonial art exhibit held at the prestigious Torquato Di Tella Institute for the Visual Arts in Buenos Aires. The exhibit catalog listed it among other pieces that came from churches, lay and religious institutions, museums, and private collections. However, the catalog only provided a brief description informing the reader of its size and technique. This is a 200 by 140 centimeter piece painting in oil on canvas, and in typical 18th century Alto Peruvian tradition, basic gray, light blue, and rose hues dominate the background, and black and vermilion appear on accents and highlights. The year and place where the portrait was produced are unknown. So that's all we know about this painting. This presentation analyzes the portrait of Francisco de Paula Sanz following the guidelines of art historians of Spanish and Spanish-American portraiture, as well as the methodology employed by cultural historians of the body and gestures. It additionally draws from the Spanish-American concept of calidad. Calidad, representing one's social body as a whole, would refer not only to skin color, but also to occupation, wealth, purity of blood, honor, integrity, and judgment. In Spanish America, calidad was placed at the core of a diagnostic system that oversaw, affirmed, and maintained social and racial hierarchies. So calidad is essential as a concept for maintaining social hierarchies. My interpretation of this portrait continues my previous work on the ceremonial and jurisdictional clashes that pitted Sanz against Viceroy Loreto. At the time, the former held the office of superintendent in Buenos Aires. I have analyzed these ceremonial conflicts following the theoretical models of Clifford Geertz, Norbert Elias, and William E. Miller. Although this presentation is exclusively focused on Sanz's portrait, I argue that his physical representation was in line with his politics, which aim at achieving political preeminence, neither by force nor by bureaucratic procedure, but by ritually challenging and eventually humiliating his opponents. Ruling in 18th century Spanish America, Sanz was additionally concerned about the proper perception of his social body and the accurate public assessment of his calidad. In the first section of this presentation, I provide a brief biographical and bureaucratic sketch of Sanz and describe his political style. In the second section, I analyze the portrait by highlighting both the conservative features associated with royal portraiture, as well as those innovative or eccentric elements present in Sanz's portrait. So we have a portrait here that has conservative features and have innovative features, and we need to understand why, or my interpretation. So now we're going to talk about the sitter. Francisco de Paula Sanz was the presumed illegitimate son of King Charles III. He was born in Naples in 1755 and left for Spain in 1759 when his father succeeded to the Spanish throne. He was 22 years old when he arrived in Buenos Aires as the appointed director of the Royal Tobacco Monopoly. That's a good job, by the way. In 1783, he became superintendent of the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, remaining in office until 1788, when the superintendency's jurisdiction was restored to that of the Viceroy. After completing his period of service as superintendent, he was appointed provincial intendant in Potosí, regarded as one of the most important posts in the Americas. This man has an incredible career. Being the intendant of Potosí in the 18th century is a big deal. In Potosí, rumors about Sanz's royal ancestry became a political issue. In 1809, after Napoleon's invasion of the Iberian Peninsula and the capture of King Ferdinand VII, Sanz claimed the Spanish throne, asserting that he was in fact the son of Charles III. The following year, he openly opposed the revolutionary movement that had started in Buenos Aires, and through a murky institutional process, he engineered the separation of the territory of the Audiencia de Charcas, that's where it's Potosí, from the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata and its annexation to the Viceroyalty of Peru, an area still loyal to the captive Spanish monarch. When a revolutionary army dispatched from Buenos Aires reached Potosí, its leader immediately executed Sanz by firing squad, along with 2 other high-ranking royalist officers. There are not that many Spaniards or Spanish officers that have been murdered through the Wars of Independence. He is one of them, right? And remember, he just claimed the throne. In my previous work, I have characterized Sanz's political style as that of the anti-Bourbon officer, one who befriended those who he should have disciplined and kept in his pockets a nice share of the crown's wealth. These features made him very agreeable to many men of power and means, and enjoying their esteem, he established with them powerful patronage networks. Moreover, Sanz took advantage of the conflicts generated by the Bourbon reforms in the hierarchical and honor-bound community of Buenos Aires, and challenged with displays of wealth and generosity the authority of Viceroy Loreto. He did not follow the bureaucratic and political rules of the time. However, he was promoted to one of the most coveted positions in the Spanish Empire, that of the Intendancy of Potosí, which he held for 21 years until his execution in 1809. Sanz's political persona and style were described by Gregorio Funes, a contemporary observer and amateur historian who served as the dean of the cathedral chapter in the city of Córdoba. In his comprehensive essay of the Rio de la Plata in the Viceregal and early Independent period, Funes wrote, and I have the quotes there for you, Sanz was both political and popular, and embellished his social skills with unlimited generosity and gentleness, and therefore enjoyed the esteem of many. His kindness made him quite lenient, diverting him from his obligations. His politics, far from pure, included a large dose of duplicity. His generosity was expensive and detrimental to his interests and those of the state. On the other hand, Loreto was depicted as his opposite. This is the viceroy with whom he engaged in many conflicts, and it's good to have them together as a contrast. So Loreto was severe and aloof, loved the truth, and generally followed the path of justice, preserved his hands clean despite the bad examples given by other viceroys in the Americas. His tough and scrupulous administration of justice was merciless. He was too eager to investigate matters he should have ignored. Inaccessible, proud, and austere, Loreto only gave ambiguous answers. His loathing was ruthless, arrogant, and capricious. His Oriental style and pride kept him distant from moderation. So, in reference to the confrontations between Sanz and Loreto, Funes stated, the people generally sided with Sanz, who, enhanced by his grades, managed to transform his defects into signs of goodwill, what Loreto's inflexibility made of his virtues the objects of popular hatred. Consequently, despite his evil deeds, Sanz was never detested and Loreto was never loved in spite of his service. So we have a lot of emotion in these quotes, and we can talk about them in the Q&A. So now we can talk about the portrait. Art historian Rosemary Mulcahy argues that portraits in early modern Spain perpetuated the memory of distinguished individuals. However, the thematic range of Spanish portraiture was limited to royalty, aristocrats, and clerics, and as such, there are only a few portraits of merchants, men of letters, bureaucrats, and artists. Moncaghi additionally contends that court portraiture primarily fulfilled three aims. First, it promoted the power and prestige of the ruler. Secondly, it projected territorial control, as the royal portrait made the absent king present in remote territorial possessions. And thirdly, it emphasized royal legitimacy, continuity, and succession through the creation of portrait sequences or galleries, galleries displaying in chronological order the image of the monarchs. So portrait galleries, I don't know if you have been to portrait galleries of kings and queens where you have them ordered in chronological order, so you have like a sense of the succession there, one after the other, sense of normalcy and continuity. Spanish portraiture crossed the Atlantic and became a popular genre at viceregal courts. Mexican and Peruvian viceroys either brought from Spain or commissioned in the Americas full-body portraits of themselves that imitated those of Spanish kings. Spanish-American viceroys also created portrait galleries that became offshoots of the royal galleries. Several authors have argued that in Spanish America, portraits stood in for the viceroy when he was away from the viceregal capital. Additionally, copies of the viceroy portraits were sent to remote parts of the viceroyalty where the real presence of virus was never expected. In both instances, portrait made the absent body of the viceroy present, and therefore they counted among the devices available to monarchs to symbolically represent kinship and dynastic continuity. The portrait's power can be compared to that of public celebrations organized for royal marriages, coronations, births, and funerals, as they psychologically bridged the distance between rulers and subjects and aided all regime societies in coping with the anxieties of dynastic successions. So we have here a series of portraits of viceroys, and we can talk about the visual formula in a minute, so I want you to look at these images while I talk. Moncaghi additionally contends that the success of portraits depended on their format. Portrait painters follow a strict codified system of representation that made of portraiture a simple, direct, and conservative but highly effective genre that lacked both allegory and innovation. The social and political purposes of formal portraiture came above stylistic experimentation and compositional eccentricity. In other words, the image of majesty was sufficient to create the illusion of a royal presence. So the formula is pretty conservative, and we will talk about it in a minute. The standard visual formula depicts the sitter in three-quarter profile, in a courting or columned interior, and wearing finery, jewels, and medals of honor. A window or opening in the background displays a landscape, a cityscape, or a seascape that makes reference to the sitter's dominion. The sitter that does not hold the symbols of power, if the sitter does not hold the symbols of power, they are displayed on a golden, silver, or tastefully ornate wooden table. A family coat of arms advertises the sitter's lineage, and a cartouche or legend lists the sitter's names, appointments, and occasionally important dates. Females were depicted holding fans or flowers, objects considered more appropriate for their gender and symbols of their power, while religious leaders were often portrayed seated in high-backed chairs with religious books and symbols of ecclesiastical authority placed on a table beside them. So if we look at these images, we can see the standard visual formula, full body, standing on profile. We have there. So we have full body portraits. Oops. No. I'm sorry. I'm going to use here. So we have full body portraits, the cartouche listing the appointments or the important dates, the coat of arms. It's rare for them to hold the symbols of power. In this case, we do have the baton in hand, but on the floor we have other symbols of power here. The opening with the cityscape, the seascapes of the landscape showing the dominion, right? And then another set of portraits are showing this traditional visual formula, the table. In this case of the female, we have her garden is her dominion, the household, right? In her case, she has the fan. The fan is the weapon of the women. They communicate with fans, that flirt with fans, right? I don't know if you know the story of the fans as means of communication. And so these are the symbols of power for women. And what we have here is like, you know, the traditional visual formula, right? Religious men and women, or men of letters, we have again the traditional formula with the books on the table instead of the symbols of command. In the case of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, we have her seated. In the case of the rector, Don Pedro de Peralta y Barrio Nuevo, he's standing. We have the courting interior, right? And we don't have the dominion in this case because these are not men of power, right? We don't have the opening with the dominion. Although he never held the office of viceroy, Francisco de Paula Sanz commissioned a portrait that followed the composition, props, and design established for royal and viceregal portraiture. It presents the cedar, let me just go there, in full body, in a courting interior, and finely dressed. His image appeared behind an open burgundy velvet curtain, wearing a gray wig, white silk stockings, a pair of black velvet knee breeches, a red velvet waistcoat, decorated with silver thread, a black and red doublet with silver embroidery, and fine lace cuffs. Courtings were prominent features in formal portraits, as they were used in royal ceremonies to create a theatrical effect in relation to the appearances and disappearances of the royal family. This effect enhanced the power of portraits, as it made the cedar appear as the equivalent of the physical bodies emerging behind the curtains at court. So when you have a court function, the royal family may appear suddenly from behind the curtains, right? So that was a theatrical effect that was transferred to the portraits. Likewise, in royal ceremonies, those appearing behind the court seem to be in portraits. So there is that similarity between the portrait and the royal appearance in court, and then the royal appearance and the portrait. And let me show you. This is the canopy room in Mexico City. So here you see how the physical presence of the viceroy, you know, the viceroy is absent, but the portrait is there and is hanging behind a velvet curtain. So this visual formula was very powerful, and it was repeated. In Sanz's portrait, the window in the back opens to the silver mountain of Potosí, a reference to his dominion over the region. The cartouche on the lower left corner lists his titles and appointments. The sturdy-legged silver table holding the sword and baton of command were painted in front and in line with the opening showing the Cerro Rico of Potosí. So we see here an interesting line between his dominion and the table and the symbols of his command. This sequence of objects allowed the viewer to connect through an invisible line, Sanz's symbol of power with his dominion. In her study of Peruvian portraiture, Nenita Ponce de Leon El Pic argues that the conventions of royal and viceregal portrait were appropriated by Spanish American elites, who found in the strict imitation of older portraits a way to bolster and even fix their claims to elite status. This practice, although popular among Spanish elites, was more fully embraced in Peru, where families and institutions constructed grandiose lineages through the commission of stylistically conservative portraits. Following El Pic, it can be argued that Sanz, by adhering to the rules of royal and viceregal portraiture, was able to play out his royalty and fix his lineage, regarded as impure due to his illegitimacy of birth. In the Spanish colonial world, illegitimacy of birth constituted a major stain, as it affected one person's access to property, honor, and office. Illegitimacy of birth additionally affected the public perception of colonial subjects, and consequently, it diminished a person's calidad. However, in the Spanish setting, legitimacy was not necessarily a permanent condition, as it could be changed and even legally removed if the parents eventually married. So if you're born as an illegitimate child and your parents can marry, then you can be legitimized that way. Moreover, if there were impediments to the marriage, illegitimate children could legally change their status by petitioning a gracias al sacar. We'll talk about this document in a minute. A restatement of status through gracias al sacar encompassed a lengthy, financially costly, and legally cumbersome process. It means in mid-1770s, sorry about that, these royal grants became harder to obtain. The success of the petition depended not only on personal allegations and documentary evidence, but also on the testimonies provided by witnesses willing to support the petition. In other words, the change of status was contingent on the public perception of the applicant's status. It is evidence that Sanz's illegitimacy did not hurt his career. However, since colonial elites were not exempted from the rigors of calidad, he employed all the resources available to conceal his stain. I will advance my first conclusion here. A portrait that followed the conventions of royal portraiture conferred to Sanz in a visual format what gracias al sacar confers to others through a legal document. The portrait itself would have been insufficient for Sanz to pass as legitimate royalty. However, when combined with his wealth, his prestigious appointments, his social posturing, and political maneuverings, the portrait acquires an enhanced symbolic power. However, Sanz's portrait departs from the strict rules of royal and viceregal portraiture by incorporating eccentric elements and slightly changing the pose of the sitter. While dogs and servants were present on individual and family portraits of royalty, they did not become the norm in royal portraiture, informal portraiture. So we have informal and family settings that made it portraiture, but formal portraiture did not incorporate dogs or domestic servants. For the rest of this presentation, I will argue that far from diminishing Sanz's status, these unconventional elements were used to enhance his masculinity, authority, and standing within the colonial context, and also allowed him to fix his illegitimacy in a comprehensive way. Both in Spanish formal portraiture partially drew upon the portraits of Renaissance male leaders. Let me back up a little bit. So as we were saying before, here's what we have in the canopy room where the curtain opens and you see the image of the viceroy, in this case even representing this theatrical effect. And here we have someone admiring a portrait, right? And so you see how formal the pose is, hat off, looking at the portrait as if it were the visual representation of the king. Here's the Cerro Rico Potosí. Here's the dominion over where Sanz exercised his power. And this is an Andean lord also who made a portrait of himself. He commissioned a portrait for himself following this formula. We can see the standard elements on that formula. So back to where I was saying. Pose in Spanish formal portraiture partially drew upon the portraits of Renaissance male leaders. Their bodies were represented as giving command, with one arm outstretched, sometimes holding a scepter, baton, or whip, the other arm akimbo, their weight on one leg, in a hip-shot pose with the other leg casually extended. So in the men depicted here in the center, we see almost that perfect posture, but all of them are more or less in the same posture. So this is the ultimate Renaissance masculine pose, right? Direct eye contact. Historians of gesture argue that this pose, inspiring classical military leaders, indicated boldness, self-possession, assertion of success, or defiance. Direct eye contact additionally enhanced the effectiveness of this pose. In 17th century, this pose partially changed, and consequently, Spanish monarchs and viceroy frequently posed full body with one knee slightly bent. Suitors wore that dark somber clothing adorned almost exclusively with the large white gorget and the red cross of Santiago or the blue cross of Alcantara. These crosses are the crosses that you get when you become a member of the noble and military orders of Santiago or Alcantara. Their facial features reveal an aloof expression that have the effect of distancing the portrait from the observer. The 17th century pose became a hallmark of Spanish authority, and as such, the Spanish gravity, this is the way it's referred to, Spanish gravity, became a recurrent theme in European manuals of manners, and many of them even recommended well-mannered persons to observe a calm and erect posture when standing, walking, or sitting. So this is the Renaissance posture here, and here we see how this posture evolves into the Spanish gravity. It moves from being very bold and assertive, right? And now we see a more nuanced type of posture that represents this idea of Spanish gravity. However, the sitters commanding pose very, very little, and their faces remain expressionless, betraying little or no emotion. Sanz's portrait adhered only partially to these conventions, while his body, we can go back. Sanz's portrait adhered only partially to these conventions, while his body appeared in full length and with his knees slightly bent. The gestures indicating military boldness were absent. Moreover, he did not hold in his hands the scepter or the ceremonial sword, which rested on the silver table and partially concealed under his hat. Instead, he posed with one hand inside his partially unbuttoned waistcoat, known in the 18th century as the held hand in, or the pose called hand in waistcoat pose. So that pose when you have your hand in waistcoat. Art historian Alain Meyer, who studied this pose in English portraiture, states that it was suitable to the taste of 18th century European men of quality and worth who preferred to exhibit character instead of passions. Men who chose this pose preferred to be depicted in a pleased and agreeable attitude. Meyer associates the pose with a body language described in etiquette manuals as conferring, and I quote, manly boldness tempered with modesty. So these are bold men, but they're modest about their boldness. It's very interesting. Modesty in this case was represented by the hand withdrawn, a device used by classical rhetoricians and actors in still and quiet action. So here we see again how theater comes to the picture, still scenes in a theatrical representations require that pose with the hand held inside the waistcoat or hiding, concealing the hand. Meyer's arguments are supported by Rebecca Haidt, who studied the human body in 18th century Spain, argues that discussions about the body became intertwined with classical physiognomics. In that intellectual context, the visual examination of human bodies, especially male bodies, became a system for diagnosing a person's interior disposition, fate, or character. We're not just talking about bodies here, we're talking about interior disposition. In other words, 18th century gentlemen's bodies acted as descriptors of their masculinity. Following both authors, it can be argued that Sanz was portrayed in the hand-in-waistcoat pose because it was more suitable to represent in body language the inner qualities of an 18th century Spanish gentleman. It was a pose that conferred the seater the capacity to display bodily control, not only in an aloof and grave fashion, but in one that was evidenced by his virtuous masculine character. In other words, Sanz appeared not only as a man of authority, but also as a good man, a man of moderation, a gentleman. In Western European portraiture, the body language of the seater was commonly hidden by the subordinate body of others. David Davidin, who studied the image of blacks in Western art, makes a similar claim, stating that in Western portraiture, the presence of a white master or mistress, dog, and black servant denotes a hierarchy of power relations in which superior whites appear surrounded by inferior creatures that bolster their standing. In this portrait, Sanz emerges from the central position as ruling over both, the black servant attending to him and the animal sitting at his feet. Dogs in portraiture were used by Western artists to reflect the character of the seater, to suggest emotion, to indicate gender, status, wealth, or simply add a narrative to the scene. Breed, size, and posture of the animal also matter. The naturally grateful greyhounds represented nobility, fidelity, and good breeding, while the small, fairy, and excessively groomed lapdogs appeared as the loyal companions of female courtiers. Dogs physically communicated with the master through caress and gaze, denote emotional attachment as well as loyalty between seater and animal. The portrait of an illegitimate prince did not have room for a greyhound. Instead, Sanz was depicted with a heavy-set Pila dog, sitting slightly behind his feet, very close to his master, but aloof and avoided both physical and visual communication with him. Pila dogs, known as Chimu dogs in Peru, developed from a breed native to the Americas. They were small, heavy-set, and hairless. Their baldness increased their body temperature, and consequently, they were commonly used in South American households to keep the feet and body of their owners warm. Hot water bottle here, in animal format. Additionally, in pre-Inca Andean cultures, the Pila dogs were associated with funerary rituals. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that they were frequently buried with their native masters, as it was believed they would guide them through the underworld of the dead. Sitting at Sanz's feet, I argue that the Pila dog embodies the indigenous, the natives of the America from whom Sanz draws comfort and labor, and over whom he exercises his legitimate lordship. However, this allegorical reference of the natives did not reflect their ethnicity, cultural and geographical diversity. On the contrary, this metaphor rather simplified and homogenized the natives vis-a-vis the nominal presence of Sanz. In early modern Europe, the presence of the African house servant denoted wealth and sophistication, a sign of exotic taste. Black male servants primarily performed the decorative roles of pages, footmen, and butlers. Boy pages, on the other hand, were favored as personal attendants of noble women. Given their fixed role, it is not surprising that until the late 18th century, European portraits recorded Africans primarily as servants and as decorative accessories of their masters. African servants in portraiture tend to gaze adoringly at their masters or mistresses, who may be touching them or accepting fruits or flowers from them. African servants were seldom individually identifiable, and they frequently appeared as props rather than as actual persons. As in the case of the natives, portraiture homogenized the social existence of the Africans. The black servant in Sanz's portrait closely follows these conventions, and as mentioned above, his presence coupled with that of the dog contrasted with and heightened Sanz's status. The composition of the trio strictly followed courtly rules of precedence. Sanz's dominant persona demands more personal space and therefore takes the central position in the portrait. Rules of precedence establish that those of inferior rank appear to his left and slightly behind him. While the dog takes the right-hand side, the fact that it lays at Sanz's feet rules out any challenges to the hierarchy of ranks. His black servant, however, dutifully respects Sanz's personal space, appearing behind him and to his left. The presence of the servant's large frame is contained by Sanz's hind in waistcoat posture. His abode, which denotes authority, additionally serves as a space marker, a social boundary that separates master from slave. So if we go back to the image of the bold posture, the elbow is not an accident here because all these men claim masculinity and boldness, but at the same time their elbows are a sign of their space. So they're demarking their own space as well. And so we see that the elbow, although in a different pose in Sanz's portrait, served as a space marker. Finally, Sanz was portrayed handling a letter to his servant. Sanz's hand holding the letter, his servant's hand, and the symbol of power and authority appeared as unified through an invisible line across the painting. So I want you to pay attention to this invisible line here. Remember, we have I'm having a hard time with this. We have an invisible line connecting the openings with the symbols of power. Now we have another invisible line horizontally going through the letter and the hands. Letters and documents represented in European portraiture the power of the word, the power of persuasion at odds with coercion and military might. In Sanz's portrait, I argue that the letter symbolizes the legitimate, gentle, and civilizing lordship of Spaniards over the natives and Africans, at least the way they perceive it. Conclusion. Antwinen's study on illegitimacy describes the process through which colonial elites publicly represented and shaped their individual and group identities. While in theory, birth and social status appeared as fixed categories, in practice, the negotiation of identities vis-a-vis peers and other groups revealed their flexibility. Calidad, as a social category, encompassed not only wealth and power, but also dress, behavior, and posturing. Colonial elites fully embraced the system of calidad and utilized it to preserve their own standing as well as the hierarchical order in the Americas. Post-colonial theorists define colonialism not only as a period in which Post-colonial theorists define colonialism not only as a period in which Western chronology, but rather a dynamic mechanism. Post-colonial theories define colonialism not only at a period in Western chronology, but rather a dynamic mechanism used by the West for constructing its own history for dominating other cultures. Colonialism instituted hierarchies of judges and knowledge and opposed in a binary system the Occidental and the Oriental, the civilized and the primitive, the scientific and the superstitious, the developed and the underdeveloped. While these categories reduce complex differences to binary labels, self and others, they became enduring features of colonialism because they summarized the logic of colonial power. Colonial identities were constructed within this positive and negative complex of signs and practices and were inseparable, entangled, and unstable. Functioning within the colonial context, Francisco de Paula Sanz constructed his image of legitimate Spanish royalty, not only in reference to the Spanish power, but also in opposition to the simplified identities of Indians and Africans. It is not surprising that he constructed this image using the visual formula of the portrait. Visual and literary systems of control were created by colonial powers as mechanisms for simplifying, pinning down, and ultimately controlling the complex social and racial realities of their possessions. In Spanish America, the colonial gaze drew its power from the concept of calidad, which permitted the assessment not only of the appearance but also of the character and circumstance of the colonial subjects and bodies. Francisco de Paula Sanz mastered this art. Paradoxical, his colonial power skills sentenced him to death. Thank you. It was too good. Let me show you before we wrap it up. This is a pila dog, present day pila dog. Nobody knows what a pila dog is. But they're still being bred. They're not being kept fat any longer. But it took me a while to find that image. But yes, that's the pila dog. Questions? Yes?
Where is the pila dog exactly kept?
Well, it's original from the Americas. It's really hard to find like a present day breeder. But you know, they're common in the Andes.
Yeah,
And
I think so.
I am from Argentina. When I was, I go to Buenos Aires every year and I try to find a breeder, and it's really hard to find. I mean, like, I want to see a pila dog live, and they're hairless,
Right.
and so they're different, and they're not necessarily appealing creatures.
I think.
This is the cutest.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't want to be rude to them, but they're not very appealing. This is like the cutest picture I could find of a pila dog. Yes.
Because my mom's from Peru, so when we went back, I'm pretty sure they mentioned it. I think so. I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that maybe they're easier to find in Peru because the origin is from the Andes.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I was like, I'm pretty confident I've seen.
I would love to see one live, but I haven't been that lucky. Yes.
Like during the speech, like you were reading the article, which it was probably published by you. May I know where I can find this so I can read it at home?
I can send it to you.
Oh, thank you so
No problem.
much.
I will give it to Aaron.
Thank you so much. Or I can just take several pictures.
No, I can send you the file.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
no
Appreciate
problem
it.
at all. I mean, and this is a draft, so don't
Because I
even.
pay all my attention to this and we
I can send. You can have the paper and you can have the presentation as long as you don't do anything with it because it's not ready to be in the public domain
No,
yet.
I won't.
It's the preliminary
I just want
version.
to, yeah,
So
read it,
I don't cite, don't nothing. It's just there. Yeah, I will share with anybody. Any questions? Yes.
I have a quick question. So I think in your argument you mentioned the social function of that portrait and how he may have benefited from its presence and so on and so forth. And so I wonder, to what degree did he influence the painter in constructing all the different aspects of this portrait? I mean, what influence do you have on including this and that, or having a dog and so on and so forth?
You know, I wish I could find more information about the painting itself, and it's very frustrating because, the painting is in Buenos Aires, and I started to wonder if it was painted. I mean, I had two theories for a while, because he was in Buenos Aires when he was appointed to Potosí, so he had to travel. So maybe it was a painting commemorating or celebrating his appointment to Potosí. Clearly, that is Potosí. That is not Buenos Aires. And the cartouche lists Potosí there, right? And so, for the longest time, I thought that the painting was commissioned while he was in Buenos Aires, and then he took it to Potosí. The painters in Buenos Aires are not necessarily good at this point, right? It's really hard to find a good painter. The quality of the paint is not great either, so he could have been a Buenos Aires produced painting. Now, my other theory is that when he got murdered and he got assassinated by firing squad, it could have been that the painting was in Potosí and the painting was sent to Buenos Aires as, okay, we killed him, and here's the evidence, we have the painting. Right, so I have my two theories that I don't know what to do with them because I cannot find any information about the army that killed him, saying, and we're bringing down the painting of Sanz as a proof that we killed him, right? And you'll never find that direct type of evidence in history, but I have nothing to speculate. even, I have not found any correspondence saying, and the painting is there, or something that can give me the hint to make that claim. So I wish I could find more information about the painting itself and how did it end up in Buenos Aires, because it's right, we don't have in Buenos Aires portrait painters, right? And so, I can speculate about my two theories with what I have, and I will probably when I get these published. But at this point, it's just theory, because it could have been like, okay, I got commissioned and I get the painter. It could have been that, Castelli, who was very vicious about who needed to be murdered, very selective but very vicious. He was the commander of this army. He could have sent that back, saying, hey, I got him, here's the evidence, right? And so I'm not sure where to stand on that one. And I'm still speculating. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yes.
I have a question sort of piggybacking on Aaron's. So you talked about these portraits as a mechanism of colonialism and a way to, I don't know, representationally shore up authority and power. But you also mentioned that these representations are unstable. And I'm thinking about post-colonial theorists, like Onibaba saying, there's always some pushback, there's resistance, and you can deconstruct a representation and sort of try to find the holes and the gaps that might suggest it's not as authoritative as it seems. I'm coming from this as a literary critic, by the way, so this is what I do with text, but it's harder with art. And I'm just wondering if there are ways, there's some cracks in the veneer that you could see in the painting, or ways in which...
I kind of play with that idea, but, I'm focused on the painting itself as, this is my text, right? And so I'm just telling what I'm seeing. Now, the only way for me to embrace that argument is to say, well, he was so good at it that, he got killed out of it, right? It's like, that's the pushback.
Yeah.
He figured it out so well that everybody was able to read it to the point that there was not mild pushback. There was not just a crack. We need to get rid of this man. And he claimed to be the legitimate son of Charles III when Ferdinand VII was in prison, and he said, I need to separate this territory from the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata because, those people are too subversive for me, and I want to become the next king in the Americas. And that's why, that bold movement, was the one that sentenced him to death, right? And so that's the only way, if I adhere to the text, I could be more creative and bring in other texts that I work on when I define his political style and such. But I think that, the big pushback here is, we cannot keep him at any rate. No, it's a handful of royalists that were actually assassinated. It's a handful, right? It was not just we're going after these big figures, right? And he was one of them. And so I think that's the big pushback. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.